Dr. Simon Friederich has a background in physics like myself, but actually finished his master unlike myself, and then went on to become an academic. And he's now associate professor at the University of Groningen and specializes in philosophy of science and mathematics, epistemology and methods.
Hi. Good afternoon, everyone.
And he's also one of the two academics in the Netherlands who lecture on existential risk at the Observatory. At the Observatory, we hope that many will follow this path. We're very excited to be able to welcome you here at our conference again. So we'll now give the stage to you, Dr. Simon Friederich.
Yeah, many thanks, Otto, for the kind invitation and for the opportunity to talk about my research here today. So my talk will, in comparison to what was just discussed, be much more basic, much more foundational, and I think you will find that it connects to questions that you may have asked yourself. And namely, the overall topic is how can we influence the future at all, right? So I mean that's a question that is surely very central to all our attempts to mitigate existential risks. How can we hope to influence the future at all, and also to the extent that we have to make decisions what we want to focus on. Do we want to focus on problems right now that may seem rather tractable, but are limited in scope, or rather should we rather focus on problems that are more down the road and have uncertain prospects of success? What should we do? I will not answer this question straightforwardly, but I think I can clarify some aspects that are really important to resolving this question. I will share some slides with you that I think are helpful to understanding my points. Here is the. Can you see the slides? Also, can you confirm that this is fine? Okay. So the notion that takes center stage in my considerations is the notion of cluelessness, and I will explain in a moment what that is. Right? Cluelessness and existential risks. I will first explain to you, that's the overview of my talk here, why what the cluelessness worry is, what cluelessness is in the first place, then why it matters. Well, distinguish between two different types of cluelessness that have been distinguished in the literature. I will then talk about causes and background conditions. So this is relatively basic, but I think still important and instructive. But distinguish sensitive and insensitive causation. That in turn will help us to somewhat alleviate the cluelessness worry. And this in turn will help us see some relevant points about whether it is a good idea to turn our attention to the long term, or more like try to reap more imminent, more direct benefits when we invest our efforts. So let's start with this cluelessness worry. That's a worry I think that many of you may have had at some point in their lives, but it was formulated for academic purposes by the philosopher Lenzen 21 years ago, as a problem for consequentialism. Right? Consequentialism is the school in moral philosophy that says that how morally good an action is, that depends on its consequence. Right? If it has good consequences, then we should do it. But if it has the best consequence, then we should do it. If it has the bad consequence, then we shouldn't do it. So, and my colleague Hilary Greaves, who's also a background in philosophy of physics, but then really turned to effective altruism and existential risks, gave a very nice exposition of this worry in 2016, and I will mostly discuss her work because it's very instructive. She first distinguishes between an objective and a subjective version of this worry, and I start with the objective one. And the objective, the worry, the cluelessness worry about objective consequence betterness, right? C betterness is consequence betterness, is that we can never have even the faintest idea for any given pair of acts, A1, A2, whether or not A1 is objectively C better than A2. So, and C better just means has better consequence. So the worry is that, it sounds more complicated than it is, right? The worry is that for any two actions that I can choose between, I can never know which one has the better consequences. Right? I don't know, should I help this person or that person? Should I stay in bed a bit longer? Should I get up early or so? I can never know what is better, what is morally better. And actually, that may sound absurd, this worry, but Hillary Reeves thinks actually that this worry is true. We can never have this faintest idea, and why. So this is her a long passage that explains it very well. That's why I quote it in full. The argument for this cluelessness worry stems from the observation that all relevant consequences, that the relevant consequences include all consequences of the actions in question throughout all time. In attempting actually to take consequences into account in practice, we usually focus on those effects, let us call them foreseeable effects, that we take ourselves to be able to foresee with a reasonable degree of confidence. These may or may not be any intuitive sense direct effects, or may not be close to the point of action in time and or space. And while we are arguably correct in thinking that we are justified in being reasonably confident in our predictions of these effects, any choice of one act A1 over another A2 inevitably has countless additional consequences that our calculation takes no account of. A butterfly flapping its wings in Texas may cause a hurricane in Bangladesh. So too may my telling a white lie, refraining from telling that lie, moving or not moving my hand. A hurricane will certainly affect which other butterflies flap their wings or which other agents move their hands in which ways. And so the effects will ripple down the millennia. So right, the idea is that whatever I do now, it will have effects for what happens, like for the weather a couple of weeks down the road somewhere else on the world. And that weather in turn will influence what happens there. And so ultimately, everything that happens like in the forward light cone of here right now will be causally influenced by what I'm doing now. And I can't know all that, of course. And so I can't know which is the best act to do now. Even for two acts that I want to compare, I don't know which one will have the better consequence, because the consequences are huge and I can't overlook them all, right? So that's the worry. Typical philosophers worry, I think you will, in your everyday lives, will not be very disturbed by this, but we wanna put our engagement with existential risk on a firm philosophical basis, so we have to take this very seriously. So Hillary Reeves thinks this worry actually holds. So we really can't know which act has the better consequence, but maybe we don't need this, she says. Maybe we don't need to know which act actually has the better consequences, but for which act has the better expected consequences, right? So for which we of course we can't know exactly what will happen in the future, but we can have rational expectations, and we should choose the act that has the better, according to consequentialism, right, that has the better rationally expected consequences. So the one that has higher expected value, when I need a utility function for that, right, and define my probabilities over what will happen in the future, but consequentialists routinely do that, so that would be fine. So maybe that will get us out of this worry. But of course, we can then state another cluelessness worry about that subjective level. And Hillary Reeves formulates it like this. She says, the worry is we can never have even the faintest idea for any given pair of acts, A1, A2, whether or not A1 is subjectively C better than A2. And that means just that so A1 is subjectively C better than A2 if and only if the expected value of the causal consequences of A1 is higher than that of the expected value of the consequences of A2. And this is a worry that Landman endorses. Agrees, says sometimes yes, sometimes no. Okay, so that's the cluelessness worry, right? So we can basically, because of how complicated the world is, we cannot know how things will turn out depending on how we act now, and yeah, and that makes it impossible for us to identify the right course of action. That threatens the entire effective altruist project. Though especially the points where effective altruism, makes the most concrete recommendations. In a recent talk, Hillary Reeves formulates it like this. She writes, "What I get is a deep-seated worry about the extent to which it really makes sense to be guided by cost-effectiveness analyses of the kinds that are provided by meta charities like GiveWell." Right? GiveWell is a meta charity that investigates how effective which charity is, right? How much good you can do per euro. So I recommend very much donating according to the guidelines of GiveWell, but now Hillary Reeves expresses here a worry about that, that is motivated by the cluelessness worry. if what we have is a cost effectiveness analysis that focuses on a tiny part of the thing that we care about, and if we basically know that the real calculation, the one we actually care about, is going to be swamped by this further future stuff that hasn't been included in the cost effectiveness analysis, how confident should we be really that the cost effectiveness analysis we've got is any decent guide at all to how we should be spending our money? That's the worry that I call cluelessness. We might feel clueless about how to spend money even after reading GiveWell's website. And so we might donate according to the recommendations by GiveWell for some good cause. But then the worry that Hilary Greaves has here is that, well, whatever happens after the effects of our donation that we intended happened, there still, it has made a difference in the world, right? So some people have maybe gotten a vaccine extra, or so have got some cash, so that will make a difference. And down the road, that will make those differences will amplify, and the differences in the world with and without our donation may be so large that is actually what dominates the moral goodness of our choice. And this was, I introduced this following Lenman as a problem for consequentialism, and now we talked about it for in context of effective altruism. But recently, the effective altruists McAskill and Mogensen have argued that it's actually even worse for non-consequentialist normative ethical frameworks, like deontological frameworks, where it's the moral quality of an action is then not dependent by how good its consequences are, but whether it is in conformity with your duties. And their line of thought is this, that if our actions have potentially drastically negative long-term consequences, like even just potentially, then the ethically safest option seems to be to refrain from acting at all as far as possible. And this leads to paralysis, and we can't do anything anymore because very far down the road, basically because of what we are doing now, people might get killed, right? So it's better not to do anything then. That seems absurd, but it seems to follow if we take the cluelessness worry seriously. So now let's try to sort this out, right? Something is fishy about this cluelessness worry, and Hilary Greaves has a diagnosis of what goes wrong there, and I think what I will offer you is a better diagnosis. So that's the reward that you get for attending this talk. So Hilary Greaves argues that in many cases, the probability of some act A having a very bad long-term unforeseeable consequence and the probability of not performing that act having the same unforeseeable very bad consequence, they are often equal, right? And this is an instance of the principle of indifference, according to Lenman, and Hilary Greaves concurs. She agrees with that. So an indifference principle, a probability theory is like what you have with a die. If you don't know anything about the die, or if the die is fair, then the probability of the different outcomes of the die are equal, right? If you have 6 options of what the result of the die toss can be, then the probabilities of all the 6 outcomes are 1/6. So for the coin toss, it's 1/2, and so on. Like if you have a die with 20 sides, then it's 1/20. And so that's an indifference principle. And indifference principles in general are regarded as problematic in philosophy, and that's why Lenman thinks this is no good answer to the cluelessness worry. But Hilary says actually sometimes they are fine. And these cases are cases of simple cluelessness. Well, I must say, after thinking about this a while, I'm a bit puzzled by this suggestion, because I don't think it helps. Right? What we really need is not an indifference principle, but what we would need to alleviate the cluelessness worry is that these conditional probabilities, I hope you can see my cursor here, are that they are equal, right? That it doesn't make a difference whether I do A1 or whether I do A2, right? A1 could mean donating to Against Malaria Foundation, and A2 could mean not donating to Against Malaria Foundation or so, right? If the expected, the probability that something very bad happens after I do one is the same as it when I do the other, then we are fine, right? Then you can concentrate on the intended short-term consequences of the donation, namely saving someone's life or sparing someone a very unpleasant illness. And this has nothing to do with indifference, because the indifference principle applies when we ascribe equal probabilities, right? Here in front of the conditional probability stroke and not behind it. So I think Hilary Reese has the wrong diagnosis here. Something else is going on. Still, she thinks that even, well, and I think she's right, that even to the extent that this is the right diagnosis, there are cases of cluelessness that remain problematic. Namely, sometimes we have so-called what she calls complex cluelessness. That means that we, for some pair of actions of interest, A1, A2, right, we donate, whether we contemplate whether to donate to this or that charity or not, or to this charity or that charity, or so, we sometimes have reasons to think that the unforeseeable consequences of A1 would systematically tend to be substantially better than those of A2. And vice versa, right? That's the second statement. We have some reason to think that the unforeseeable consequences of A2 would systematically tend to be substantially better than those of A1. And it's unclear how to weigh up these reasons against one another. And she has, as an example, the donations to the Against Malaria Foundation. So I think it's a bit, I don't know, almost a bit tasteless, her examples. But I mean, I get the point. So she says, if, let's say, this is a very efficient charity according to GiveWell, it's quite likely that if you do this, if you do donate to them for a while, then you will save a child's life. Right? They distribute bed nets that can prevent malaria. So, but saving a child's life has knock-on effects, for instance, on population size and thereby on resource use, the size of the economy, etc. And some of these knock-on effects will be positive, some will be negative. And here she thinks there is, the simple cluelessness analysis does not work. There is no natural symmetry between, for instance, the arguments for the claim that the world is overpopulated and those for the claim that it's underpopulated, or between the arguments for and against the claim that the direct health benefits of effective altruist interventions in the end outweigh any disadvantages that accrue via diminished political activity on the parts of citizens in recipient countries. So sounds more complicated than it is, right? So we have reasons to believe, she says, that if we donate to the Against Malaria Foundation, it will have, in the longer term, down the road, it will have good effects, and we have reasons to think that it will have bad effects, right? Good effects are, right, if we prevent that illness, then also, that child can go to school also, and it will have will be empowered in that will have the economy can flourish and so on. So there are substantive reasons to believe that down the road the consequences will be good overall, and there are also, she says, systematic reasons to think that this will be bad, right, because of increasing pressure on the environment or so. The many problems will actually be aggravated by this. I don't know whether the example is good for that, but I think you get the kind of point about it. Many things leading to these trade-offs. I will give you further examples at the end of my presentation. So what I think Hilary Reese's diagnosis about cluelessness has not really been right. Right. So and to give you hopefully better diagnosis, I invite you to just reconsider with me that cluelessness, the cluelessness worry ultimately relates to the causal consequences of our actions. Right. It's about what will be the long-term causal consequence of our actions, and to help us maybe get rid of this worry or see more clearly what's going on here, it's good to concentrate on what are causal influences in the first place. And I give you 3 simple examples that help us see some important aspects of this. First example is Betty causes the room to light up by hitting the light switch. Second example is Claire causes the death of her husband by pouring poison in his tea. And the third example, Danny causes the life of a child to be saved by donating to the Against Malaria Foundation. So these are all statements that state that something is the cause of something else, right? That state the existence of a certain cause and effect relation. But for them to make sense, always certain background conditions need to be in place. So consider the Betty example with she just switches on the light, right? She causes the room to light up. What we need for this to happen is electricity provision, right? We need a switch and the bulb that are in place. We need a transparent medium like air in the room and so on, right? So these things all need to be in place. And in the literature, these are usually referred to as background conditions. In Claire's case, we need the poison to be effective in the specific husband's body, right? So if the husband cannot be like have a very unusual organism that is immune to this poison, right? And then he must really do the drinking, right? He's not good if he's distracted at the moment where he's supposed to drink, otherwise the poisoning will not work, and so on. Until he's distracted such that he does something else, and so on. And in the case of Danny, right, the nets that whose donation she pays, they must really be used. The mosquitoes must end up being kept out. The bank transfer for her donation must work. The transfer system must be in place, and so on. A lot of things must go well for really the kind of the mouse click of Danny to result in the life of a child being saved. A lot of things need to be in place, and these are all the background conditions. Okay, so we have causes and background conditions that lead to effects. That immediately raises the question, well, how do I distinguish between causes and background conditions? And I think there are broadly three options that one can consider, and different contributions to the philosophical literature draw the line differently. You can in a way consider all of them causes. You can say background conditions is just a conventional name for some of the causes, right? You can say also, in a way, what the bank does with the money that you donate, that's also part of the cause of the life being saved. So the actions of the bank also cause the life to be saved, and the organism of the husband who is poisoned, that its susceptibility to the poison, that's also a cause of his death, and so on. But the bad thing about this is that if you go down this road, then it's very hard to exclude anything, right? Because everything that in a way, everything that happened in the distant past is then also part of the cause, and that's not how we usually use the notion of causation. What we usually, for instance, if the police wants to know, well, what caused the death of Claire's husband, then they want to know really, right? The thing that they have in mind is such a thing as Claire's poisoning her husband, and it's not like the susceptibility of the husband to the poison, if right, basically every organism would have been susceptible, or the lack of something that attracted him. That's not the cause, that's just like the background that can be assumed as given. So, and that's, I think, a drawback of this first option. Another is to look for an objective distinction between cause and background conditions. A third one is to accept the distinction as contextual and perspectival. And I think the last option is the most attractive. I think it will often depend on what we are specifically interested in a given context, what we regard as the background that we can agree on is the normal way for things to turn out. So I will assume that this is the right way to go, right? So that a standard example to make this plausible is an example of a famine that occurs in a country, in a poor country. A famine occurs, people starve, and it's due to, in a way, what came together was bad weather, like a drought or so, not an extreme drought, just a drought that occurs every couple of decades. And that can be seen as the cause, but others, like in the UN or so, they think the government failed to take the right precautions, right? So that's also they didn't store food, or so they didn't store enough fertilizer or whatever. And what you see as the cause may really depend on what your profession is, right? What your professional view on this is. If you are from the UN, then you would have expected such a drought sooner or later. So that's not in a way the cause, that's just a trigger. And it's these droughts occurring regularly, that's part of the background, you would say. And on the other hand, if you're a farmer who is now hit by the famine or so, you might say this is the drought was the cause, and you don't even count on the government because that's totally out of the area that you control. So I think that therefore the last option is most plausible. So we have to distinguish between causes and background conditions, and that distinction is partly like a bit conventional. It depends on the context, on our perspective in the context under consideration. So having established that this is an important distinction, or having motivated it as an important distinction, I can introduce another distinction, and that is the one between sensitive and insensitive causation, right? So let's say we have a cause and effect relation, and then it will hold for certain background conditions, right? For instance, like smoking causes cancer or so, right? That holds for certain background conditions for human organisms, for instance, right? That if you smoke, you make it more likely that you contract cancer, so that holds for certain types of human organisms. And you can ask, does it hold for a lot of background conditions or only for very specific ones, right? And that's the distinction between sensitive and insensitive causation, right? For insensitive causation means the causal relation in question obtains for a wide range of background conditions. Sensitive causation means that it obtains only for a narrow range of background conditions. So for smoking and cancer, I think we would typically say that it obtains for a wide range of background conditions, because basically for all human organisms, the kind of mechanism that leads to cancer because of smoking, as far as I'm aware, at least, the kind of mechanism is there, right? On the other hand, there might be, if you have a sensitive causation might also occur, right? It could be that like you have built up a very complicated structure of pipes or so in your garden, and then you throw in a ball, and when it goes through the entire structure, then it I don't know, a bell sounds or so. Then you could say that you're releasing the ball causes the bell to sound in a very sensitive way, just because how you specifically have set up the pipes, where the ball goes through. That could be seen as sensitive causation, right? So in a way, these are of course vague notions. There might be scenarios where we disagree on which causation is sensitive, which is insensitive. Partly the distinctions in the eye of the beholder, but I think it's an important distinction. Now, I give you one more example for a sensitive causation that's adapted from the great philosopher David Lewis, right? So David Lewis, a philosophy professor, writes a letter of recommendation for a PhD student that she should get a job at a prestigious other university. That causes the PhD student to get that position. That causes someone else not to get this. That other person stays where she is. That causes her to marry someone who they would otherwise have married, and then maybe they get a kid or so. And the birth of that kid, you can see that as caused by David Lewis letter writing, very indirectly, and that's highly sensitive, right? So if given how history was, well, that's somehow you can see that if David Lewis hadn't written that letter, then maybe the kid wouldn't have been born, or so this couple that their parents wouldn't have married. So that's in that sense there is a causal link, but it's in a way cherché, right? It's not natural. Someone actually, I think there is this story, I don't know whether it's true, that some cleric actually saved Adolf Hitler's life when Adolf Hitler was still a kid or so, right? You can ask yourself, did that cleric actually cause the Holocaust or so, right? So to the extent that that's the case, that's very sensitive causation, right? Because it depends very sensitively on all the history in between the boy Adolf Hitler getting saved and him initiating the Holocaust, right? So that's sensitive causation, if it is causation at all. I'll come to that in a moment. But then another example of insensitive causation, I take a porcelain cup, I throw it onto the ground, I cause it to break, right? That's usually what happens if I do this kind of stuff, right? There could be like a pillow or so, and that causes that makes this not happen, but otherwise it's what happens. So this happens for a wide range of background conditions. That's insensitive causation. I hope the distinction is clear. So my next point is that hypersensitive causation is not really causation. I can, let's come back to the letter writing example, right? David Lewis, the philosophy professor, writes that letter of recommendation. And I think it's natural to say here, well, this impression that we have it to do with causation here, that is just an artifact of how we slice up history in a very, very artificial way, right? So it's much more natural to see the latter as merely historical background about what happened, who moved where. The real causes of the marriage of the couple, or the birth of the child, and the love of the parents, their common plans, and so on, right? Maybe the smile of her smile or his smile when they first met, or so, but even that might be disputed. So I think that at least agrees more with how we use causal influence in our everyday lives. So I think that's the next point here. It requires adopting a very specific and context or perspective to pick out the letter writing among all kinds of other events in the past and to designate it as a cause, right? So that is that's not how we usually identify causes. And adopting very artificial perspectives of how to slice up the world in cause and background conditions is not really the point of causation. So if you feel tempted to deny this, if you feel that actually, right, David Lewis letter writing really is a cause among many others of the couple marrying later in life or so, then I invite you to consider the following. Assume that you are one of the people whose decision where to go to school or university was relatively spontaneous. Right? There are kids who know, like, I want to go to like Groningen to study later or so, but others make that distinction much more ad hoc, and it seems relatively arbitrary. Right? They have many good choices. They go somewhere. Right? But then, if that's the case for you, then you can imagine that if any detail in your past before coming to that decision had been slightly different, then you might have chosen a different university, right? That would have. So then everything in your past actually is a cause of where you studied. That seems weird, right? That seems wrong. It seems much more adequate to say that all these other things in your past are really just the background, and then the cause of your choice for a specific university was what happened at the open day or so, right? And not everything else in your past, even though it also seems true that had other things in your past been different, right, then you might have made a choice for a different university. I hope the point is clear. So the overall message here is hypersensitive causation is not really causation, right? You can slice up the world in such ways that you get the impression that you have causation here, but that's basically overdoing it with the philosophy. So, and now I come back to the cluelessness worry. My diagnosis of simple cluelessness actually that has nothing to do with the principle of indifference, but with hypersensitive causation. If you choose the background conditions in a reasonable way, like we do normally in the social sciences or so, then there is no causation here. The actions under consideration are themselves part of the background. And then also coming back to what Hilary Greaves wrote about cluelessness, is the butterfly in Texas does not cause a tornado in Bangladesh. That's very misleading to talk like this. I mean, you can adopt a highly peculiar perspective on world history and draw a very artificial line between causes and background conditions, or you can say everything is a cause, but that's not helpful. And then it seems like that was the case. But it's much better to much truer to how we actually use the concepts of cause and effect to say that the butterfly in Texas is just a part of a tiny part of an overall background and not the cause of whatever tornado or like a storm in Bangladesh. Right, competent users of cause would not in the actual everyday or scientific lives draw the line there, I argue. So that's my diagnosis of what goes on with simple cluelessness, right? So that I think for the cases where it seems really artificial to consider what will happen far down the road, I think that's the right answer, right? That would be highly sensitive causation that we consider here, and we don't have to worry about that because highly sensitive causation is not really causation at all. But what about complex cluelessness, right? That was when we considered, for instance, the donation scenario and had reason to believe that donations like ours will make the world a better place, or that actually long term it will make the world a worse place. what with that? I have no clear answer here, but my hunch is a bit that we should take the assumption of rising living standards as a default background conditions, because because that's what we want to happen, and what we have good reason can happen, and then only factors determining how living standards rise as potential causes. So that would even so then we have basically that directs our attention to the question, well, if we want the living conditions or the health situation in developing countries to be better, we can compare different kinds of interventions, but we shouldn't ask, like, should we intervene at all? Should we help at all? Right? Because it might increase ecological pressure. So that's just a suggestion. Maybe if you have worries here, then let me know afterwards. But there are still in situations with complex cluelessness, and now I really come to existential risks, because I think, regrettably, these are particularly situations where we have at least near cluelessness in a complex way, right? So there are definitely situations where we know our actions can have long-term, or like can have unintended, unforeseeable consequences down the road, and we have reasons to think that those consequences will be good, and we have other reasons to think that those consequences will be bad, and we don't know how to weigh them up, or we are at least not sure how to weigh them up. That happens. That can really happen. For instance, imagine you're a politician. You think about lowering the tax rates for the rich, and you ask yourself, what will the causal consequences be for poor people? Right, so and that's very complicated. I mean, as far as I know, at least as far as I understand about tax policy, that's very complicated, right? Then of course you have the tax return, the incomes for the state from taxes get lower, but then maybe enterprises will invest more. And how that will pan out in the end is very, very difficult to predict. So that is, I think, maybe we are not clueless here, but at least if we have reasons to think it will turn out fine for poor people, we have reason to think it will turn out disastrous. And it's not easy to know, right? And then now I give you more examples, and these really have to do with existential risks. So Hilary Greaves, paradoxically, I think, when considering cluelessness, advocates long-termism, right? The view that actually our actions should try to improve the long-run future of humanity, and she advocates that as a response to cluelessness along the following lines. She said, if we want to know what kinds of interventions might beneficially influence the long-run future, we just need to look at what people in fact do fund in the effective altruist community when they're convinced that long-termism is the best cause area. They're typically things like reducing the chance of premature human extinction. The thought being that if you can reduce the probability of premature human extinction even by a tiny little bit, then in expected value terms, given the potential size of the future of humanity, that's going to be enormously valuable. So, and I think that Hilary Greaves has it backwards here. So if we take serious measures meant to reduce the probability of premature human extinction, then these have the potential to backfire. So complex cluelessness is a real threat here. I'm not saying that we are always completely clueless, but things can go wrong here, right? So especially here, my point is basically in the malaria case, when you are donating, when you consider donating against malaria, you shouldn't worry so much about the long-term knock-on effects of what you're doing. But if you do existential risk mitigation, I think we need to be very mindful of these things. So I give you 3 examples here, but I could give you such examples basically for every existential risk that was mentioned. So let's consider AI, right? Artificial intelligence. Let's assume that we are under the influence of the worry that AI will pose very serious risks in the future. I think that's a reasonable worry. So we might react by tightening AI safety rules. But what, of course, can happen in these cases, and that's not super specific to AI, but it can, the kind of thing that can happen then is that the development of advanced general intelligence, right, the one that is really, that we are ultimately worried about, that this will be slowed down in the region of the actors who are actually most concerned about it, who are most aware of the threat. And that actually those end up developing AGI faster who are not very concerned about it. And that might make things worse. right? So if you tighten the rules of a powerful technology, if you ask for lots of committees and to have a say on what gets permitted, what gets licensed, and so on, then of course you risk that in regions of the world where there are no such scruples, they develop it a lot faster. Or, I mean, we just heard the very professional talk by Ingmar Rentzok about climate action. I have here as an example the strengthening of the youth climate movement. I think that's also partly what he did, but he didn't mention that so much in his talk. Right, that might help a lot. It might help a lot mobilize young people for climate protection, but it might also increase partisanship, right? So create a group of young people who are very concerned about the topic, and others who react with cultural anxiety, and actually that might divide society, increase partisanship, or give more power to people with an unhelpful diagnosis of the climate problem. When I can tell you personally, I worry about, for instance, what Ingmar told, that he underplays the difficulty of decarbonization, right? Moving to emission-free sources. Maybe he's right that this is going so fast and smoothly, but I think this may be his confidence that this will work out might be premature, and then this could actually be detrimental. I'm not saying that it is, right, but it's not a crazy worry. I claim, or I mean, we can also consider natural risk. We can consider setting up a program to deflect asteroids, but that, of course, has been mentioned by some people, can create capabilities to actually direct asteroids toward Earth, right? So if you want to really do something serious about about an existential risk beyond having a conference like this, which is nice, but like we are having talks about this, like abstract talks, but like this, then if we want to do concrete things, we can also do harm, right? I mean, another example would be with nuclear technologies, right? So should we increasingly harness nuclear energy to increase energy provision to mitigate climate change, or will that, like Susie will talk about, but maybe also talk about proliferation risk? Will that make the risk of nuclear war worse? Also, whatever action you take here, it can have bad consequences if it really matters. So I'm not saying that always when we dealing with existential risk in a substantive way, we are confronted with complete cluelessness, but a lot of uncertainty, and I think often near cluelessness. So the upshot of my considerations is that when we consider acts with intended short-term consequences, it's typically fine to consider only those consequences. Potential long-term consequences that we can imagine, we typically count them as causal effects only if we choose background conditions in a natural way, and then that's highly hypersensitive causation, which I think is not really causation anymore. And the second point is that we are typically in a state of maybe near cluelessness, complex near cluelessness with respect to the long-term future, and especially also with respect to existential risk mitigation. The more concrete measures we implement to mitigate existential risk, right, the more concrete steps we take, the more risky these measures tend to be. I'm not saying that this is always the case, right? There might be ways of, for instance, reducing the risk of nuclear war that are just unambiguous positives, like taking them off high trigger alert or so might be just an unambiguously good thing, but the majority of steps, I think, can also, in principle, backfire. It's not totally obvious that they will not backfire. Yeah, so much for my talk. I'm curious about what questions there might be. Should I stop sharing, Otto?
Yes, if you want to, please. So thanks a lot, Simon, for the quite interesting talk. It's nice to think a bit more deeply about existential risks and about these matters in general, I think. So yeah, indeed, there are two questions from the audience. Let me start with the first one now. And there's also some things that I'm interested in myself. First one from the audience. Do you think that humans have a sensitive or an insensitive causation to AI as an existential risk?
So the question is whether we have a sensitive or insensitive causation to AI becoming an existential risk. So that would mean that whether AI turns into maybe creates an existential catastrophe for humanity, whether that depends very sensitively on specific things that we do now or so. I'm not sure that I completely understand the question. My reaction to a question in the vicinity would be, I think for beings like us that develop science and have high technology civilizations, the development of AI is pretty much unavoidable, right? It's just so useful. It's just there will be people interested in that. The benefits, the direct benefits for the actors who do it will be so large, so that will happen. In that sense, I think the development is relatively insensitive with respect to specific things that we can do. The very fact that more and more broadly applicable artificial intelligence will develop, I think that's gonna happen more or less in any case.
Okay, another question from Jan Willem van Putten. Don't you think that we should decouple long-termism and existential risk? To me, it seems perfectly fine from a near-termist perspective to worry about existential risks, given the magnitude of the problem.
Yes, I think that's a good one. It actually occurred to me when I had completed my slides that I should have kept these a bit more apart. It's a bit, I followed a bit Hilary Greaves in her recommendation as a response to cluelessness. Let's turn to, become long-termists. But of course, you can easily justify also in terms of near-term considerations that existential risk should be taken very seriously. But still, even if you do that, I think that the worry that we are if we want to have a substantial impact on existential risks and really drive them down, the probability of things going wrong precisely because of what we do is always to be taken into account. So if something really matters, it can also make things worse. Not always, maybe, but very often, I think.
Another question, perhaps a little bit along the same lines. If you believe that the risk of human extinction over the next century is something like 1 in 6, as Toby Ord suggests in his book The Precipice, then it would be worth the US government spending up to 2.2 trillion to reduce that risk by just 1% in Americans' lives saved alone. Not really sure what the question is, but could you comment on that?
Yeah, I think that makes the point that it was maybe that my talk maybe mingle up existential risk mitigation and the long term too much, and I concede that. So it's a good question. I think the person who asked it was inspired by a recent 80,000 Hours podcast with Carl Schulman, which I also just read, and it's a good point. Still, I personally would ascribe a lower probability to human extinction than 1 over 6 in this century. I think that's too high. It may help to draw awareness to it, and maybe I'm unreasonably optimistic, but I don't think it's that high, right? We are talking like complete extinction, complete destruction of the human potential. That is very dramatic what must happen for that, and it depends very much on the case for AI, right? So that's, but of course, yeah, I'm also concerned. Even if it's 1 over 60 or 1 over 600, even it's still extremely large.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. That it's your estimate of what your action should be quite depends, I think, on the quantification of the existential risks. That's so I can relate to that point, and maybe a little bit related. So at the Existential Risk Observatory, we're also in a bit of a clueless situation, of course. So it's particularly relevant for us, I think, this talk. Something, for example, that we shouldn't communicate existential risks to a general audience, but only to experts. We make the estimate that benefits outweigh the downsides, but it's hard to be completely sure. Can we use your method of dealing with the cluelessness worry in any way to become more certain about what we are doing?
No, actually, I'm very sympathetic to that worry. At least for specific risks, I am not at all sure that it's good to involve a lot of the population in it. I mean, on the other hand, I don't think we should really keep anyone out, right? So, I mean, that would be very undemocratic. I don't mean it like that, but for complicated problems, it really often doesn't help if in a public if it gets like culturally loaded or so, what the right solution is. So for instance, I am a bit worried about the climate movement. I think it helps with many things, but also it can create impressions of what is easily doable or so, what if just politicians want it or so, that actually may make it harder to decarbonize. Not sure about this, but I don't think it's a crazy worry.
Mm. Yeah, that thanks for that answer. That makes perfect sense, I think. So
so creating awareness is not always good. Okay, so maybe it's most often good, but it's not. I'm pretty sure that it's not always good.
So it's really hard. It's also really hard, right, to be sure about whether it's good or not. It's
really hard.
I think it's extremely hard to have any kind of conclusion on it.
And just the kind of often, like, I think technocratic problem solving in a circle of experts who have a reasonably good grasp of a problem can be the best. Right? Of course, they must really know. I mean, I don't know. Yeah, they must not be driven by other things too much, right? Than that are not in the common interest. But then,
my personal feel, if I may go to that direction, is a bit that it really depends on the amount of risk you think is present now. For example, if you think that now everything is really going in the wrong way, then you might take some more drastic actions to steer it. But if you think now it's going pretty much all right, but there's a lot that you can screw up in that way, then you might be more cautious. So I guess the actions really depends on the what you think are the realistic numbers as well.
Yeah, or I mean, it's always becomes more complicated if many actors are involved, and the general public might not really understand that. Yeah, for instance, in the late Cold War, I think the German Chancellor Schmidt, for instance, agreed to having lots of nuclear missiles on the German territory, and so that was opposed heavily by the peace movement, and I really don't know what to think about this, right? So in a way, of course, I sympathize with the peace movement, but then, of course, the end of the Cold War came relatively soon, and the Soviet Union collapsed, and it might have contributed to this, because might have made it harder for the Soviet Union to keep up the Cold War. So maybe it was a peace-creating measure. I have no idea, right? It's just it's just what the broad public wanted, like with huge marches and so on, might have been counterproductive.
Might or might not indeed.
Might or might not, but I just don't know, right?
Yeah. That's On a different note a little bit, you're presenting a course about existential risk at Groningen University, is that right? What motivated you to start this course, and do you think it would be good if others would follow suit in the academic world?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I teach such a course for third-year liberal arts and sciences students at the University College, and for second-year honors college students. Yeah, I started this course. Yeah, I think I think it's good if young people are get aware of this, who really could make their career choices with respect to it. I think that's something different than just alerting the broad public of this, which may be also fine. But then, like the kind of providing information and giving clues about what really promising cause areas are, that's really something that I think is valuable in academic education. So that's why I do it. And it's also I don't know, it's also fun in a way, right? Usually I do a philosophy of physics that is quite abstract, and that fascinates me as well. but the relevance of that is, of course, very, very indirect. And for existential risks, it's the relevance is super tangible, of course. Just the question is what you can really change. Yeah, but well, that comes afterward.
Maybe one more question that I think is interesting for a philosopher and has to do with existential risk, although not that much with your talk, I guess. But what I've heard is some existential risks are not only ending humanity, but also a lot of other species as well. That's also what people are worried about, of course, in climate change, but also other existential risks could have the same effect. And there are also some that might even end all life in the universe. Perhaps there's more life and they might end that as well. Should we take these issues into account in the moral weight that we assign to the risks?
So, question: should we also be concerned about extinction of non-human species and potentially any intelligent life? Well, that's a question of values, and people may have different values. I think for me personally, I would say that individual species have intrinsically have more like an aesthetic value. Their subjective well-being might have an intrinsic value. But then to preserve as many species as possible. So I think that's mainly an aesthetic concern. Of course, it can also be an instrumental concern because it might be in our interest to keep certain species around. But otherwise, I think it's more aesthetic and therefore maybe not as high for life overall and for I don't know, sentient beings overall in the universe. There are these. I mentioned the Fermi paradox in my power hour contribution. There are people who think that maybe we don't see any extraterrestrial life because the cosmos is such a hostile space and all the civilizations kill off each other, like also with anonymous probes. So there's, for instance, the dark forest scenario is very, very intriguing. I hope that that's not the case, right? I hope that that's not true. Subjectively, but that's again a question of values. I would find it very nice if, many tens of billions of years down the road, the universe would be teeming with sentient beings and not just be empty and just with dead matter. But that's, you may feel differently about this. It's very subjective.
Maybe one more final question about existential risks, a bit more in general, and that is, if these existential risks are so important, I was quite puzzled when I first learned about them, that I didn't hear anything about them before, and I think that's a question that more people have. So if the existential risks are indeed so important, then why do we hear so little about them? What's your take on that question?
Yeah. Well, that's also an empirical question, right? That I'm not extremely well prepared to answer, but I think we have a tendency to get caught up in things that are not that we are not by evolution equipped to identify the problems that really collectively matter by far most to us. I think we often worry about things that are comparatively tiny, and that's. So at some point, I think academia then notices, okay, we should reset our priorities, and I think you are part of that movement to really identify what matters, and that's something that I really support. But it's maybe not too surprising that this happens, right? Also, not everyone agrees that cost-benefit considerations are really have such value in itself, or are we the way to go? But if we do, then of course, existential risks should receive far more attention than other things.
That's a great note to end, I think, and I want to thank you for both these talks at the
Thanks for having me.
Existential Risk conference, and maybe we can talk later about these things in more detail. But thanks already.
Okay, yeah, thanks for attending, for having me. Bye-bye.